Hello everyone online.
Today, I have two videos for you. I'll be talking about the situation in Korea and Japan. Let's discuss what's happening in Korea, because Lee Jae-myung has been elected as South Korea's president. This South Korean election happened because Yoon Suk-yeol stepped down, so it was a by-election. That's how things work in South Korea. If a president gets impeached, then within 60 or 90 days, they have to hold another election right away, and the president who gets elected serves a full term, not just the remainder of the previous term, so the number of terms often changes. Lee Jae-myung will serve a full term as president. After all, he is the president of South Korea. What impact will it have on the game between China and the United States? In this video, I'll break it down for everyone. The 21st presidential election was just held. The voter turnout was very high, 79.4. That's the highest in 28 years. The highest in 28 years. That is, up until the last term. Up to Kim Dae-jung. There were over 35.24 million voters. Every election is very intense, but this time, surprisingly, so many people came out to vote. The Central Election Commission officially confirmed Lee Jae-myung. He received 49.42% of the votes. Actually, there were three candidates. This Kim Moon-soo got 41.15%. That's an 8% difference, because there was a third party, the Reform Party, which got 8.34%. So in the end, he got nearly half the votes. Lee Jae-myung didn't get a majority. He won by a margin of 8.27%. That's quite a big margin. In the 2022 election, the 2022 election was just 3 years ago. There were supposed to be 2 more years left. Yoon Suk-yeol, because at that time he declared martial law, ended up impeached and removed from office. He lost to Yoon Suk-yeol by a tiny margin of 0.73%. There were few votes separating them that time. This time, when Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, he was very brave, climbed over the wall, and went into the parliament to hold a meeting. He gathered half the people together to overturn the martial law order. His term started at 6:21 a.m. on June 4th. Term starts. The inauguration was held 11 a.m. There was no transition period, immediately in power, because there was no president. There was only an interim president at the time. The election happened because of Yoon Suk-yeol. Martial law was declared October 3rd, which triggered a constitutional crisis. On April 4th, he was impeached and removed from office by the Constitutional Court. What I remember most from that time is that I already said Yoon Suk-yeol was done for. Yoon Suk-yeol was definitely finished. Back then, Park Geun-hye, her close friend, and even those who interfered in state affairs were forced out of office. Nor Yoon Suk-yeol. What he did was truly unconstitutional. Lee Jae-myung delivered his victory speech at the National Assembly. Indicates election number 3 was a response to Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law and to the People Power Party's failure to stop him that day. It was the people's judgment on them. That's absolutely true. As for Yoon Suk-yeol, because you declared martial law, you were meant to let National Assembly convene, and the Assembly has the power to overturn you with a majority of seats. But you tried to stop the National Assembly from meeting, or even arrest members of the Assembly. That is definitely unconstitutional. No matter where you take this to court, you'll lose. Lee Jae-myung said that his top priority after taking office would be to overcome the rebellion, and to make sure that no one ever again points guns and knives. Military coup aimed at the people. In other words, after he takes office, it's clear that, without a doubt, he'll certainly make some changes in the prosecutor's office. As for those who assisted in the last coup, they will all be prosecuted. That includes the prime minister at the time and the acting president who came after. All of these people will be charged because a lot of people knew about it, and many also helped Yoon Suk-yeol. All of these people will be prosecuted. He promised to launch a 35 trillion won economic stimulus package to push Korea's index above 5,000 points. Is 35 trillion won really a lot of money, after all? Korean won is among the least valuable. Right now, it's about 200 won to $1. So that's actually just over 100 billion. It's not a very big budget. 100 million Hong Kong dollars. Rate 1 to 150. 200 billion Hong Kong dollars. That's actually not a lot of money. And they're also strengthening oversight of family-run conglomerates. As you know, those big family-owned chaebols in Korea, like Samsung, Korea's icon, should I use 3 stars? They account for something like 10 to 20% of Korea's GDP. But these families, whenever I watch Korean dramas, the villains are always these chaebol families. It's always these chaebol families. The people in power are usually the bad guys. Even the presidential candidates in Korea are usually the bad guys. But these people end up in jail all the time. Lee Jae-myung has been to prison twice. His family has been going to jail since his grandfather's time. The Democratic Party has 300 seats in the National Assembly. They got 171 seats. That's why Yoon Suk-yeol wanted to declare martial law. Because the National Assembly is controlled by the opposition party. He can't get anything done. That's why he declared martial law. He wanted to dissolve the National Assembly. This is the problem with Korea's political system. South Korea has a presidential system. But the National Assembly also holds a lot of power. If the president and the National Assembly are controlled by different parties, the country is really hard to run. We'll present the great wild small legislative advantage. They can do anything because he has an absolute advantage. All right, now let's talk about his stance on China and the U.S. That's what we're concerned about. It's his position on China, you know. It's clearly different from Yoon Suk-yeol's. So what is Yoon Suk-yeol's stance? He's pro-America and anti-China. And Yoon Suk-yeol did something really significant for South Korea, which was reconciling with Japan. In the past, their Democratic Party faction was anti-Japan. They would still bring up and discuss issues like the comfort women, especially in discussions, and fall out with Japan over it. It was because they wanted to sue Japanese companies, saying that during World War II, forced labor and they owe compensation. So during Moon Jae-in's time, relations with Japan were quite strained. Yoon Suk-yeol managed to mend that relationship. Now, Lee Jae-myung's position is to repair relations with China. He also has to protect his alliance with the United States, the South Korea-U.S. alliance. Right now, a lot of overseas Chinese KOLs are saying that he's pro-communist. First, you need to understand that Lee Jae-myung is carrying on the legacy of the Democratic Party, which goes all the way back to Kim Dae-jung. People like Moon Jae-in from this faction have always advocated for better relations with North Korea, meaning that South Korea and North Korea shouldn't be so hostile to each other anymore. That's the first point. The second point is to repair relations with China. But while this policy sounds good on paper, I actually think it's not workable in practice. So, there's no need for everyone to worry about Lee Jae-myung being elected, or to be concerned that South Korea will lean towards China because of it. Why is that? Because, first of all, in the past, when China-U.S. relations hadn't fallen apart yet, there was still some room for ambiguity. Now, there's no room for ambiguity. That's the first point. Second, every president of South Korea is, in practice, forced to be pro-America. Why is that? Let me explain. There are two reasons. First, let's talk about the military issue. South Korea's security ultimately relies on the presence of U.S. troops stationed there, as well as the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Back when Moon Jae-in was in office, he proposed the three no's policy. Basically, it meant no more deployment of THAAD missiles. But Yoon Suk-yeol went ahead and redeployed THAAD missiles. If you don't deploy THAAD missiles, you end up offending the United States. But even if you stop deploying THAAD missiles, you still can't please China. During Moon Jae-in's term, the deployment was halted, and as a result, K-pop stars and the Korean entertainment industry weren't allowed in China. China kept up these sanctions the whole time. All right, military side, and Kim Jong-un is just crazy. Even though Moon Jae-in tried to appease him, Kim Jong-un even called Moon Jae-in Big Brother. But in the end, Moon Jae-in became enemy number one. They sent balloons and even feces to bombard South Korea. Kim Jong-un is dead set on making missiles and developing nuclear weapons too. So honestly, there's really nothing left to talk about. Now, what about China's issues? Like I've said before, back when the US and China hadn't completely fallen out yet, there was still some room for ambiguity. Please both. This thing does not exist now. Even Singapore's new Prime Minister said, there's no more room for ambiguity now. You have to pick a side between the two, because the US has openly declared that China is the enemy. If anyone sides with China, they're considered an enemy of the US. Aside from security concerns, in the past, people did business with China. But what's the situation now? South Korea's dependence on China has dropped significantly. It used to account for 25% of South Korea's exports, but now it's down to 19%. Exports to the United States are 15% lower, so exports to China are still higher. But when it comes to exports to China, you have to understand, it's not just a matter of export numbers. There's also the issue of technological dependence. There are two things that are essential for South Korea's survival: semiconductors, and the other is automobiles. When it comes to semiconductors, whether it's making CPUs, Samsung GPU, or doing foundry work, and SK Hynix making memory chips, Samsung also makes memory chips. And right now, the most profitable thing is making HBM, which relies on NVIDIA. In other words, whether it's Samsung doing foundry work, they really have to buy ASML's lithography machines, and they must purchase EDA tools from American companies like Cadence. So, their technological capabilities are completely dependent on the US. If you dare to go against the US, and you get sanctioned by the US, you're finished. And if the US takes action against you, you won't even be able to maintain your business with China. Why is that? Because most of what you export to China are intermediate products. For example, memory chips. Korea is the #1 country in the world for producing memory chips, but all of these products use American IP. If the US imposes restrictions on you, you can't export these products. So, there's really no choice. The Donald Trump administration was very clear about this. Either on my side, or you're on their side. If you dare to side with China, you'll face secondary sanctions from the US. For Korea, no matter who is president, there really isn't any choice. If he asks you to boycott China, don't boycott China, then the US will boycott you too. You'll die immediately. South Korea's economy. Next, discuss Korea's auto industry, the biggest export market. These are all going to the United States, so there really isn't any choice here. These two are Korea's main businesses. So when Jae-myung says he wants to balance the US and China, That's just not possible. I'm telling you right now. In a few months, he'll run into a brick wall again. The Trump administration had no problem openly pressuring you. In the past. For example, with Taiwan, the Biden administration and others wouldn't openly take a stance. Between the Kuomintang and the Democratic Progressive Party, they would show that they weren't interfering in Taiwan's internal affairs. The Donald Trump administration met once. Whenever their officials met with Kuomintang members, they would scold them. They'd say, "Stop blocking the defense budget." That's how it was. Solely Jae-myung is, in principle, friendly towards North Korea and friendly towards China as well. In reality, the situation always ends up being stronger than the individual. People asked him, "China invades Taiwan, will Korea join?" He said that would only be an issue if aliens invaded Earth. These are Tai Chi. Analysts say Lee Jae-myung's election victory was because the public wanted to hold Yoon Suk-yeol and the People Power Party accountable. And as for this particular person, he once served as the governor of Gyeonggi Province. He has a wealth of political experience, and he was very courageous even during martial law. But in South Korea, 80% of people believe that the South Korea-U.S. alliance, it is the most important thing to Korea. So he really has no other choice. The new South Korean government is facing trade pressure from the Donald Trump administration and still has to negotiate on tariffs. There hasn't been much progress on this. This is a serious issue. It is its tariffs. For example, if tariffs are imposed on semiconductors, it's possible tariffs on TSMC will be lower than those on Samsung, which is very risky for them. Their phones are made in Vietnam. And that's just how it is. Right now, Apple's phones coming out of China, it is currently exempted. But in the future, phones coming out of China, as well as those coming out of India, subject to tariffs. However, the tariffs from India are much cheaper. Vietnam has the highest tariff rates, which are over 40%. Phones coming out of Vietnam, when sold to the U.S., face a serious situation.